Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties, joined by our esteemed government affairs team, as usual, Deena Bosworth, Samantha, Gibson, Madeline, Fata. This week, we're going to do a two-part podcast. So one part this week, one part next week. Kind of a year in review, what happened over the past 11, 12 months, and what can we look forward to as we move into a new legislative session, kind of a different legislative session. And we'll talk probably more about that on next week's podcast. But first off, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that have been worked on this year. If you're a regular listener, you probably heard about them already, but we always like to reiterate these issues because some people are new to our podcast. So first up, Sam, why don't we talk a little bit about the J&J package? Got kind of done late in the year. Tell us a little bit about that package. What happened with it?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So the juvenile justice package was 20 bills, one of which was to increase the child care fund reimbursement rate for community-based services to 75%. And then another piece in that was expanding the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission to include juvenile representation. That legislation, however, was left behind. The state had concerns around paying for that, obligating dollars in future budget years that they're not sure they can do. So the reimbursement is now policy. What we saw this year will continue in perpetuity. Again, no expansion of MIDC. Those bills have not yet been presented to the governor, but they were passed out of both chambers before they adjourned for the year. There's an effective date on those for October 1 of 2024. So in fiscal year 25, those dollars will start to go out.
And then do we have an idea of the total dollar impact statewide that increase?
So they included it in this year's budget, and it was a $31.5 million increase for fiscal year 24. So I would imagine it would be similar in future years, but I haven't seen that projected moving forward.
It's still a nice increase statewide there of 31 million or so. And then on the MIDC piece, so it didn't expand. Does that have any impact on existing regulations at the MIDC, or what do they call rules or guidelines put going forward?
MIDC will remain exactly as is. So all of the changes we previously discussed over the last several months, forget I ever said them. None of them's happening.
Right. And they still are required to fund the current level of MIDC then going forward based on statute. If they don't, then we don't have to basically enact their guidelines, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So this year there was one new standard that was implemented. That's Standard 8. That was a $72 million increase. The state funded that in this year's budget. So as long as that baseline of the total 220 million is funded, local units have to comply with those standards. Any future standards, if those aren't funded, we won't have to comply with those.
Okay. And then if they don't fund MIDC at that 220 million baseline going forward, then that's another conversation, right?
Yes, a different conversation, right? Per the statute, we don't have to comply. However, counties have been doing this for quite some time now. They have departments at the local level, employees dedicated to this. So we don't know what that looks like if the state were to say, can't fund it this year. I think we would be in unprecedented times. We'd be facing some difficulties with that.
Yeah, something we'll have to keep our eye on and maybe look into a little more as we move through the end of the year here. So thanks for that update, Sam. Appreciate it. Deena, the PPT reimbursement, also something that got done later in the year, some more increased funding for counties on something that we had been promised a few years ago. You want to give us a brief background on that and what ended up with that personal property tax reimbursement?
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. So what we're talking about is the new small business exemption that was given to those businesses that have a certain level of value to their personal property. So back in December of 2021, the legislature passed this economic development supplemental bill. And in that, they gave those small businesses that had $80,000 to $180,000 in true cash value of personal property a complete business tax exemption from that. just completely wiped it out. Just like they had done back in 2014 when they did it for those businesses that had up to $80,000 in true cash value. The problem is that that was a huge hit to local budgets again, because we know how the legislature is pretty good at, passing property tax exemptions and then trying to figure out how to pay for it later. So that's really exactly what happened. And we've spent the better part of 2.5 years trying to figure out how to get this done. How to get reimbursement to local units of government, what that methodology looked like, and then making sure that the money was appropriated for it. So, luckily, that got done earlier this year, signed by the governor. So it is now state law. There's been $75 million set aside, and they're required to set aside $75 million each year to go out to local units to reimburse them for those personal property tax losses. So we're pretty happy about that. That was one of our priorities to get done this year. So pretty happy that got done.
So Deena, on that 75 million, is that part of the budget or is that a separate policy bill that allocates those funds?
So the governor originally set aside $75 million out of state funds for that first year of reimbursement. Going forward, it's now a carve out of the state's use tax that is going into that separate fund to reimburse local units of government. So again, it's a statutory carve out, which we actually really like those. And when we talk about some of the other, fund bills that we are quite proud of, it's very similar in nature to that.
And is that a flat amount or is that fluctuate?
That's a flat amount right now, $75 million into that account.
Okay.
We don't really know what the total losses are going to be, but that is Treasury's best estimate on it.
Okay, great. All right, moving along to some issues that have not moved to the governor's desk, but still remain active in the legislature as we move into this next session, which sounds like now it's not going to come, they're not going to be fully back until May, right? Is that when we're hearing the next election? It's going to kind of be?
Looks like it's going to be April.
April.
Yeah, they're going to do those special elections in April. So, if that happens, then they could be back to work. Yeah, not that they won't be back to work, Steve. I think that they will come back, but the House won't have a clear Democratic majority until after those special elections take place. So,
right. So you'll still have a lot of committee work being done in the House, bipartisan floor work, and then nothing changes in the Senate, right? They can continue doing what they're doing. And if you have first chamber bills over in the Senate, those obviously can be acted. So let's talk a little bit about that. Revenue sharing trust fund. We were successful late in the session getting that out of the House. It now sits in the Senate. You want to talk briefly about the background on that and kind of where we're at with that piece of legislation?
Very, very happy about that. So what Steve's talking about is what we've been talking about again is one of our priorities for many years is the creation of a revenue sharing trust fund. And in these bills that passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House, these bills carve out 8% of the first 4 percentage points of the state sales tax, and then takes that and puts it into a revenue sharing trust fund. That trust fund is then the pot of money that the legislature will go to allocate our revenue sharing every single year. The reason we like this approach is, number one, it's a true sharing of the state's revenue. We've seen downturns in our state budget for, over quite a few times over the past 20, 30 years. And this really would protect us from a lot of that downturn, from the legislature just not appropriating the money to fund our revenue sharing. So it's a straight carve out of the sales tax, goes into the trust fund, and then goes out to local units of government. And it allows for growth. So if the state sales tax increases, the amount of money in that trust fund would increase. Again, of course, if the state sales tax decreases, then we're going to have to, take that cut too, but it is a true sharing of the state's revenue. So those bills, like I said, passed out with a ton of support out of the House, and they're now in the Senate, and we're just waiting on the Senate to take them up, hopefully when they get back in the spring.
Yeah, so they're in committee in the Senate, right? Which committee are they in?
They're in Senate Finance.
Okay. So we need to get those out of committee, then on the floor, and then hopefully to the governor's desk. And what was the vote in the House on those?
Oh, goodness. I want to say it was like 104-6, was it? Or 106-4. It was something like that.
Yeah,
I mean,
very,
like overwhelming majority.
yeah, overwhelming support. So that's something we'll obviously want to keep pushing here early in the session, especially since they're House bills in the Senate. If we can get them passed out without any changes, streamline things as well. Good update there. Thanks, Deena. Okay, moving along to maybe some other bills that haven't didn't move that are still active. Madeline, you want to talk a little bit about the septic changes that were sitting out there, that are still sitting out there? Where they at in the process? You know, they've been introduced. I don't think there's been any movement on it. Can we give a brief update on that?
Yeah, so that legislation was introduced back in April, I believe, definitely in the spring. What that legislation would do is create a statewide septic code. It would require all property owners with a septic tank to have that tank inspected every 5 years. We've got 11 counties right now with point of sale ordinances on the books, and those would all be null and void if this legislation were to pass. So no committee hearings throughout the year, just kind of some behind the scenes work. There was actually a 4-hour work group on it last week. There's another 4-hour work group on it on Thursday. So we're definitely engaged in the process. If it's going to move, we want it to be workable for counties. So yeah, we're staying engaged on that. Might see a committee hearing in the spring, but as you said, without a Democratic majority in the House, I don't know that it'll pass that first chamber in the spring.
Right, and that was is it a one bill? Is it just one bill, or is it
It's two.
two bill package?
Yep.
Uh, Rep Skaggs is kind of running point on that right now, so obviously something we're watching. But like you said, without having majority, maybe something that does not move. And when we, you know, I keep going back to this in the spring when those seats are filled in the House. It's going to be, you know, a pretty tight timeline to get, you know, with a Dem majority to get their things done. If they have some specific priorities, saying, you know, they got a budget to get done. Then if they haven't at that point, which again, they didn't do a budget this year until later May, they started really working on it. So tight time frame again next year, election year, you know, typically in in uh, in district session over the summer. So, you know, tight timeline on some of these bills. So we'll have to stay close to them, and hopefully folks will be talking to their elected officials in the meantime as they're home over the holidays. Deena, can we talk a little bit about the veterans property tax exemption, another property tax exemption bill we've been working on for, geez, I think, when was it enacted? 2012?
9 years, 10 years. I think we've been doing it. It's
Yeah.
been quite a long time.
Right up there
Um,
with 4-year county commissioner terms. It's something that has been around for a while.
Right. I was
But
just
we
thinking
got that
about
done.
those
Got that done.
4-year terms this morning. I was thinking that was really a great accomplishment for
It took
a
10
member.
years at least.
Yeah. So veterans property tax exemption, this is for those 100% disabled veterans out there that are exempt from paying property taxes. Again, a huge hit to county budgets, to all local government budgets. And then the number keeps growing each and every year. So we seem to be having more and more veterans qualifying for the exemption. And then we see them also across the state upgrading their homes. So, you know, I mean, if you don't have to pay $400 a month in property taxes, you can afford a much more expensive home. And so we see them trading up, and we see more people becoming eligible. So that number just keeps growing each and every year. When we were first, you know, faced with the disabled veterans property tax exemption, I think the Department of Treasury estimated it somewhere around $18 million. Now we're pushing $100 million. And that's the price tag across the state. So over the years, we have worked with all kinds of legislators, with the veterans organizations and other units of local government to really push the state to reimburse us and then figure out how to pay for it and what that methodology looked like. And we all know, and those who have been county commissioners for a while fully remember that if it's a line item in a budget, that's great for 1 year, but it doesn't tend to last. And so we sought out a different solution. And Senator Bumstead really had the bills last year that kind of got everybody coalesced around the right idea. He's got him again this year, but what the bills do is they create a refundable income tax credit to the veteran in the amount of their property taxes. So when you have a refundable income tax credit, that's something that the state absolutely has to pay. It would not be local units of government who were necessarily dependent on an appropriation. But that refundable income tax credit for that veteran would be payable to the local unit of government. So they could just, the Department of Treasury would say, okay, John Smith, who had, $18,000 in property taxes last year, has an $18,000 reimbursable income tax credit, and that will be payable to, Township X, County Y, the libraries, whatever it is. And so we would get our reimbursement through that methodology. We had one committee hearing on it earlier this year where we talked about it, and still all kinds of support across the board from both sides of the aisle, except for we're really having a hard time with the administration and the Department of Treasury. And that's where the resistance is coming from. It's a huge price tag and they know it. And, when faced with all of the other price tags that they have and the different allocations of funding that they made over the past couple of years, I think it's really giving them pause as to whether or not they want to pay for it or they want to continue to make local units of government absorb that cost.
Yeah, definitely a model we want to continue to pursue too when we start seeing some of these other property tax exemptions given at the state level that affect locals. We saw with the PPT change kind of similar. We were successful there. While it took a couple years to get that done, that was a statewide exemption that increased. We were successful in getting that back to locals, but definitely something that we're swimming upstream with the administration on, and hopefully we can get some movement on that this next year. And then finally for this week, Sam, trial court funding. We've got a sunset coming up on that again. This has been going on for, I don't remember when the Trial Court Funding Commission originally met. I know it was pre-COVID, maybe 18, 19, somewhere in there.
Yep,
They came out with their recommendations. Why don't we talk about that process a little bit? Where we're at now, what we've got to look forward to next year.
Yeah, so Steve, as you mentioned, we're once again facing a deadline, an expiration date on the ability for courts to impose fines and fees on criminal defendants. The Trial Court Funding Commission gave their recommendations several years ago. The legislature has yet to implement those recommendations. So similar to last fall with the expiration date, we're going to have to extend that again. The expiration is May 1 of 2024. Less of a sense of urgency and concern this time around, mostly because we're not hanging in the balance of a Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court gave that authority back to the legislature to decide, what can courts do in this circumstance. So a few things, that we're considering. First and foremost, extending that deadline, right? With next year being an election year, pretty limited session days. 2025, we're going to have a new set of House representatives. Is 2026 the best time to extend that deadline to? You also have to implement the policy from the Trial Court Funding Commission. So there's a lot of things hanging out there that have yet to be considered. We're engaged in that process pretty heavily, as we have been throughout recent years. But priority one at this time is extending that deadline from May of 2024.
Yeah, there's 7 recommendations that came from the Trial Court Funding Commission. I think we were supportive of most of them, if not all of them, if my memory serves me correct. Started working on that process. We had, we were represented on that commission. Mike Bosonic from Monroe County was helpful there, and then we obviously have some folks that from former county commissioners in the legislature that were very active as well. Rep. Leitner from Jackson County, who's been very active with that. We're working on getting those done. Then COVID hits. Obviously things slow way down. Doesn't become a priority post COVID. Now you have a new legislature trying to educate them on the issue. It's not an easy thing to get people to understand. And so right now we're back up against a sunset date again. That's important to get extended. Like you said, either 2 years would be nice to kind of work through those recommendations and hopefully get them implemented at some point. So thanks for the update on that. We'll keep folks updated. I don't think that's a real partisan issue either. I think that's something that we might be able to get done in both chambers prior to the full both chambers being full to that May 1st date. So, well, thanks everyone. Anything else I missed or you guys want to touch on before we wrap things up? No? Okay. Well, I think, as we look for part 2 next week, some of the things we'll be talking about will be the designated assessor issue, solar PILT, minimum staffing, public safety trust fund, and some updates on infrastructure. So look forward to that in our part 2 of our year in review. Hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving last week, and we will talk to everyone soon. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.